All right, so Maajid, thanks for doing this. We've been going back and forth for months now. I've only had the show up for 3 weeks, but we've been going back and forth for a while. And you're in New York right now. You live in London, correct?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, so you live in London. So you're halfway between Los Angeles and London. So I figured we'd do the Skype because I don't know when you're going to be out here. Any LA plans coming?
I don't know. I mean, I'd love to come to LA, and I have good friends on the West Coast, but nothing fixed yet. So it's good to have this opportunity.
Yeah. All right. So we'll do the Skype thing with you in New York, me in LA. So first off, I saw a picture of you that you tweeted yesterday. You were hanging out with Morgan Freeman in a mosque. So what was that about? Yes,
this is what's brought me here to New York. I can't explain too much of it at the moment. All I can say is that I had a great conversation with him in the Islamic Center of New York. And we spent a good hour or so having a chat about the distinctions between Islam and Islamism, and about my story and the work I do. But beyond that, we're just going to have to wait and see what I was up to.
All right. Well, now he's played God, so I guess he's the right guy to talk to on that.
In the house of God, I was speaking to a man that played God about God.
All right, there you go. Okay, so I want to talk to you about some of the things that you probably did speak with him about. So first, let's just start with your story, because your biography, what you've lived through to get to here, is really, really incredible. So can you just sort of sum that up in a couple minutes?
You know, those who want the full story, it's in my memoir called Radical. But in a summarized form. Basically, I joined a revolutionary Islamist group at the age of 16 years old. I ended up on the leadership of this organization and spent 13 years with them. And I played my role in exporting this organization from Britain to Pakistan and then to Denmark and eventually to Egypt. The group's name was Hizb ut-Tahrir. It was the first among the Islamist groups to popularization of resurrecting a caliphate that would seek to conquer other countries and enforce their version of Islam as law. And their method by which they aimed to come to power was via military coups. So we were very much focused in recruiting army officers to join our organization and then inciting them towards military coups. And that's what took me to Pakistan. It's what eventually took me to Egypt. I arrived one day before the 9/11 attacks, and then 10 months later, I found myself arrested and detained and taken to the torture dungeons of Egypt's state security headquarters in Cairo, and then sentenced after 4 months in solitary confinement, sentenced to 5 years in prison as a political prisoner. At that point is when Amnesty International adopted me as a prisoner of conscience, began campaigning for my release, because of course, though we had views that I now find repugnant and would describe as extreme, we were, and the group still is, non-terrorist, which is why it's still legal in America and across Europe. So it's the distinction I draw between an Islamist group and a jihadist group, is that if Islamism is the desire to impose any interpretation of Islam over society, jihadism is the use of force to spread Islamism, and jihadist terrorism is the use of force to spread Islamism by targeting civilians. The group that I joined was an Islamist group. It wasn't a jihadist group.
Right. So I'm glad you made that distinction, because I do find that when we're having this conversation and it's being had by so many different people in so many different forms, that just the definitions alone are lost. And I know you've done a lot of work trying to just explain that kind of stuff to people so they're able to understand what we're talking about here.
Yeah, part of the problem is because this is a phenomenon that we've never really dealt with before, in terms of human beings have never really dealt with this phenomenon of ideological Islam seeking a very Bolshevik form of control, totalitarian control over society. We simply, as people, didn't have the lexicon to have these conversations. So though I use these definitions, you won't find these definitions taught in universities or in academic tomes, because people dealt with the problem before. So part of the challenge that we faced was in coming up with very crystal clear, logical definitions and then popularizing them. And so often you'll find that I repeat myself a lot. And the reason I repeat myself is because, you know, we have to popularize these terms and to popularize these concepts can only come through repetition until everyone finally begins to understand. And it got to a point where the Prime Minister of the UK understood.
Yeah.
And so we got somewhere.
Okay, so you spent about 5 years in an Egyptian prison. Now, that was under Mubarak at the time, who technically, I suppose, he was known as the president, but he basically was a dictator that was backed by the U.S. for about 30 years. What was that like, being in an Egyptian prison? I can't imagine.
Well, it wasn't a pleasant experience at all. You know, we had the torture, first of all, for the first 4 days, and then we were put into solitary confinement for 4 months. And I was held in a cell, as were all of us, in that period of solitary confinement, in cells in which we had no sanitation, no lights, no beds. We had nothing but a bare concrete cell in which to try and get through without going insane. And so I have with me, actually, I wanted to show you this because when I was arrested, I had a pocket-sized version of the Quran, which is this in my hand here. This particular Quran has been with me from the day of my arrest all the way through the torture dungeons, through the solitary confinement, and then through the 4 years in prison. And one of the things I did is, in the solitary confinement, we didn't have any light to read with or anything. So, and obviously the mind can wander in that sort of situation, and you fear for your own sanity. So one of the things I would do is stand by the door of the jail cell and wait for the light to seep in through the bars, and then I would stand there and read. If you can see, it's a very small. The text is actually tiny.
Yeah, wow.
You know, I would read that. I ended up memorizing half of it, sort of in my jail cell. But it was, you know, it was these sorts of things, and it's why I've kept this. It was these sorts of things that kept me from going mad during the solitary confinement period. And another thing I want to show you is this. This is this is a radio, which I had with me. Is sort of, it was given to me by the British embassy, and it was actually on this thing that I heard first time that we'd been charged. We hadn't been informed officially, but the BBC World Service had reported it, and so I was listening to it on this, and we found out that in fact we'd been charged, and then we would go to trial. And finally, I think this picture is up on the internet, but I have the original with me. And this is something I stole from prison, and I've kept it with me ever since because it means a lot to me. This is the mugshot that was taken of me. So that's the day. That's the very day we were dragged from the torture dungeons to be thrown into solitary. So that's before I was actually put into solitary confinement. That's me at 24 years old. And there you see what you see is my name in Arabic, Maajid Nawaz, and there is a prison number. And what I've done, of course, since then is I've taken that number, which is in Arabic, 2453, and I have tattooed it on my back as a reminder for me, actually, of those days and of where I've come from, which was your original question, and the journey that I've made to get to where I am now.
Yeah, it's such an incredible journey. One other thing on the jail thing, I find that fascinating that they let you keep a copy of the Quran with you, because wasn't Mubarak basically, not that he was secular per se, but they were, you know, the Muslim Brotherhood was illegal under him. You would think that he would want no sign of religion to get the prisoners to uprise or something like that, and yet he let you have it, or they let you have it.
On the contrary. Now, I'm not about to defend Mubarak. I cheered when he was overthrown. In fact, he was held in the same cell that he held me in afterwards. So I'm not here in any way to defend Hosni Mubarak. What I would say is that the Egyptian dictator and his regime already understood the distinction that I now make between Islam and Islamism. Their problem wasn't us holding copies of the Quran. Their problem was the interpretation that we spun and with the ideology of Islamism that I refer to. In fact, they would encourage us to study traditional medieval Islam because they knew that medieval Islam wasn't Islamism. And they would encourage us to be exposed to theologians from Azhar University, which we were in prison, and their books, so that we could read about Islam from its medieval era and understand it wasn't this modern ideological form that we'd come to adopt. Now, I say this, and I say it with a caveat, that, of course, traditional ultra-conservative medieval Islam also needs to be reformed.
Right.
You know, it's not the pinnacle, it's not the kind of, you know, the epitome of civil liberties. However, what we have to accept, anyone who knows the most basic thing about Islamic history and the development of Islamic theology will know, for all of its faults, and there are plenty of faults, by the way, and, you know, fundamentalism largely owes a debt to sort of the fact that we Muslims generally still revere that medieval period of our theology and haven't developed it since. But it's still very different to what the Islamist project is. And the Egyptian authorities knew that, so they would encourage us. They would rather we were conservative, religious, or fundamentalist Muslims than members of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. And even if you think about what's going on with Egypt now, where we sort of have another version of Mubarak and Sisi and sort of controlling things, and yet, the Muslim Brotherhood was in charge for a year and we backed them too. But that's a whole other topic. So before we move on to some of the other stuff, I saw a clip where you were on Real Time with Bill Maher from about a year ago, and on the Overtime segment, you recounted a story about a bomb maker that you met in jail. And I was hoping you could just sum that up real quick, because I thought it was fascinating, and it goes to very much what you're talking about right now.
Yeah, sure. So in prison there was we were imprisoned with the who's who of the jihadist scene at the time. We had the assassins of the foremost of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, who was killed in 1981. The group was known as Tanzim al-Jihad. Those who weren't executed in that case were with us in prison. We had the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, Dr. Muhammad al-Badi', who's since been reincarcerated, as you mentioned. He wasn't the leader of the Brotherhood at the time. He since became the leader of the Brotherhood, but he and his entire leadership were with me in prison. We have the leadership of Hizb ut-Tahrir. And we also had people that came from abroad. And the bomb maker that you referred to, he in particular was from Dagestan, next door to Chechnya. And he came via Afghanistan to Egypt in an attempt to cross the Rafah crossing into Gaza to teach Hamas how to make bombs. But he was caught at Rafah by the Egyptian authorities, and they imprisoned him. They sentenced him to 17 years. And I became friendly with this man and had a long conversation with him due to the London bombings, because the invasion of Iraq happened when I was in prison, and the 7/7 attacks in London, the bombings on sort of the buses and the tubes in London also happened when I was in prison. So I got locked into a long conversation with this man about in his view, the legitimacy of attacking London, and I was attempting to convince him that it wasn't legitimate. Now, again, because I used to belong to a non-terrorist yet revolutionary extreme Islamist group, we didn't believe in jihadism to come to power. So we were arguing with the jihadists that actually what they should be focusing on is a military coup. So that's why I was opposing him, not because I hadn't yet left Islamism. It's because my form of Islamism, in its method, was very different to his in its sort of how it seeks to come to power.
Sure.
But one thing I'm really proud of is that here's a man who was trained, who's fully capable of making bombs and causing mayhem and havoc. And yet, when I put it to him that the justification he uses to say that it's legitimate to target British citizens in that they voted for their government would be the same justification one could use for Turks who voted for their government, and Turkey is a member of NATO. And NATO as an alliance was involved in Afghanistan. And so why wouldn't he be bombing Turkey? And the answer he gave me was a pragmatic one, not a religious one, at which point I caught him out. And I said, you see, what you're doing is you're playing politics. You're giving me a pragmatic answer, which is the very thing when Bush does it, you criticize Bush for. The upshot of that conversation was, by the end of it, it took him a couple of days or whatever, he knocked on my jail cell. And he came back looking really sheepish. And he said, I've been thinking about what you said. And I think you're right. I just don't think, I agree with you. It's not justified to attack British civilians. And one of the things that really swung him was the fact that so many in the UK protested against the Iraq war. So my argument to him was, how can you be attacking these people? But I'm happy, he changed his mind. I don't know where he is and what he's doing now, but it's a small incremental step towards peace and reconciliation. And it was one of the first examples that I felt set me on the path that I'm now on.